My husband came home from deployment one day early and found my ex sitting on our couch like he owned the place. I thought I had 3 days to erase 8 months of secrets. Instead, one unexpected knock destroyed my marriage, exposed a betrayal I never saw coming, and left me sleeping in the back of a Honda Civic. But what happened after my husband opened that door was even more brutal than getting caught. And between you and me, part of me still doesn't believe I deserve everything that's happened. People look at me like I committed some unforgivable crime, but none of them were the ones sitting in an empty house night after night while their husband was halfway around the world playing war hero. Everything really started last year when Ethan received his deployment orders. 12 full months overseas in some dusty hellhole. I'd already survived 3 of his deployments before, so you'd think I'd be used to it by then. But this time felt different. We had just bought our house, which was supposed to be the beginning of this exciting new chapter in our lives. Meanwhile, I was stuck working this miserable, soul-sucking administrative job. Suddenly, I had an entire year ahead of me where I'd come home every evening to a silent house and Netflix repeatedly asking whether I was still watching. Yes, Netflix. I'm still watching. What else exactly am I supposed to be doing? The military wives around our neighborhood didn't make things any better. They were like these perfectly programmed step-forward wives, constantly preparing care packages, decorating countdown calendars, and acting cheerful about everything. In my head, I called them the deployment cheerleaders. They were always uploading those dramatic airport reunion videos like their husbands had returned from another planet. Calm down, Ashley. Your husband was gone for 6 months. About 2 weeks after Ethan left, I happened to run into Mason at the grocery store. Mason was my ex. We dated for 3 years before I ever met Ethan, and our relationship ended because Mason couldn't bring himself to commit. Classic Mason. But when I saw him again, he looked good. And I mean really good. He'd filled out a little, gotten a few tattoos, and somehow looked more grown up than the guy I remembered. We started talking, and I found out he'd recently moved back to town after getting divorced. The problem was that he couldn't find anywhere decent to live because his credit score was complete garbage. At some point, I mentioned how strange and empty the house felt with Ethan gone. Before I really thought through what I was saying, the offer just slipped out. I told him he could stay in our spare bedroom until he found his own place if he wanted. At the time, I convinced myself there was absolutely nothing wrong with it. I wasn't doing anything shady. I was simply helping an old friend who was having a rough time. When Ethan and I had our next video call, I mentioned Mason as casually as possible. I reminded him who Mason was and explained that he was going through some problems, so I'd offered to let him stay in our guest room for a few weeks. Ethan paused. I could tell immediately that he remembered exactly who Mason was. Still, Ethan did what he always did. He tried to be the mature one. He told me that if I thought it was a good idea, then he trusted me. That was Ethan in a nutshell. He always had to show how understanding, mature, and trusting he could be. Honestly, sometimes it irritated me. Part of me wanted him to show at least a little jealousy. But whatever. The following weekend, Mason moved in carrying nothing more than 2 duffel bags and his guitar. At first, both of us were extremely careful about boundaries. We acted like 2 awkward roommates who barely knew each other. There was a lot of "excuse me, after you" and bedroom doors being firmly closed at night. But there's only so long 2 people can behave awkwardly when they're basically alone together in the same house every day. Within a month, Mason and I were making dinner together and spending our evenings watching movies side by side on the couch. Nothing physical was happening between us. Because of that, I kept telling myself I wasn't actually doing anything wrong. Ethan and I still video chatted about twice a week, although I always made sure Mason wasn't anywhere nearby when we talked. Eventually, I started coming up with reasons to end our calls earlier. Work had been crazy. I was tired. I had plans with friends. Those were the excuses anyway. The truth was usually that Mason and I had plans of our own. Maybe we were going to check out some new Italian restaurant, or maybe he'd promised to teach me how to play poker. Then one evening, my friend Rachel from work showed up unexpectedly. She walked in and found Mason and me laughing together on the couch with glasses of wine in our hands. And yeah, We were probably sitting a little closer together than two old friends should have been. Rachel immediately became quiet and weird about it. Later that night, she texted me asking whether Ethan knew how comfortable Mason and I had gotten with each other. I blocked her number. Seriously, what business was it of hers? Between us, I wanted to tell her to go back home to her cats and depressing frozen dinners and stay out of my life. Women like Rachel are always so quick to judge everyone else while pretending their own lives aren't falling apart. By the 4th month, Mason and I had settled into a comfortable routine. Maybe a little too comfortable. I noticed myself putting more effort into how I looked around the house. It wasn't anything outrageous. I just stopped walking around in my old beat-up sweatpants all day. Instead, I'd wear those yoga pants that actually made my butt look good, and sometimes I'd even put on a little mascara before heading downstairs for breakfast. Mason definitely noticed. Sometimes he'd whistle when I walked past or make some comment about Ethan being a lucky guy. I'd roll my eyes and act irritated, but secretly I loved the attention. Was it really so terrible to want to feel appreciated? Ethan was halfway around the world having his big military adventure with his buddies while I was back home paying bills, dealing with problems, and killing spiders by myself. Before long, Mason and I developed this routine that almost felt strangely domestic. Every Sunday, we go grocery shopping together. We divided up the cooking, and eventually we even created this little tradition called Margarita Mondays, where we'd mix drinks and spend the evening playing cards. One Monday night, after we'd probably had one margarita too many, Mason started talking about his ex-wife. He told me how she had never really appreciated him. Somehow, that conversation slowly turned toward my marriage and how I felt like Ethan didn't appreciate me either. I remember telling Mason that Ethan had volunteered for this deployment. Even saying the words left a bitter taste in my mouth. Ethan could have asked to stay stateside, I told him, but instead he decided he needed to go overseas and play hero. Until that moment, I hadn't even fully admitted to myself how angry I was about it. But once I'd finally said it out loud, the thought wouldn't leave my head. Whenever Ethan's mother called to check on me, I switched on my perfect military wife voice. I'd tell her everything was going great, that I was handling the distance just fine, and that I was simply counting down the days until Ethan came home. Meanwhile, I was actually counting down the minutes until she'd hang up Mason, and I could get back to whatever movie we'd been watching. In my head, I couldn't stop thinking about how nosy Ethan's mom could be. Didn't she have somebody else she could mother-hen for a change? Between us, I always thought military wives and mothers acted like they deserved medals themselves just for playing supporting roles. My friend Nicole eventually invited me to one of those military wives support group meetings. I literally laughed in her face. I told her I was doing perfectly fine by myself, thank you very much. What I conveniently left out was that I wasn't really by myself at all. When Nicole kept pushing and asked whether I was genuinely handling Ethan's absence okay, I snapped at her. I told her that some of us didn't need someone constantly holding our hand. She gave me this strange look. Part of it seemed hurt, but another part looked suspicious. After that, she stopped inviting me to those gatherings. Fine by me. As far as I was concerned, those meetings were nothing more than organized pity parties. Anyway, the real change happened when I started deliberately missing Ethan's video calls. I'd text him some excuse saying I couldn't talk that night. Maybe I had a horrible migraine. Maybe there was some emergency at work. Rain check. I'd send those messages while sitting right beside Mason on the couch, sometimes with his arm casually stretched across the back behind me. Technically, I wasn't cheating. At least, nothing physical had happened. So I kept convincing myself that everything was still okay. Besides, Ethan was the one who had left. Was I really expected to freeze my entire life for 12 months just because he was overseas? Mason's original plan to stay for a few weeks had quietly stretched into 5 months, and neither of us was talking about when he planned to find his own place. Then one night, during a video call, Ethan finally asked me when Mason was moving out. I immediately got defensive. I told him Mason had actually been incredibly helpful around the house. The garbage disposal had broken the week before, for example, and Mason had fixed it. Then I asked Ethan when exactly he would have been around to take care of something like that. Ethan went silent. I knew immediately that I'd hit a nerve. Good. Maybe he should feel a little guilty for leaving me behind to deal with everything by myself. Things became even more tense when Ethan's buddy Brandon, a guy from his unit, stopped by the house to deliver some paperwork that needed my signature. There was no way Brandon could miss all the signs that Mason was basically living there. His jackets were hanging on the coat rack. His favorite beer was sitting in our refrigerator. His shoes were lined up beside the front door. Brandon looked at me in a way that made it obvious he'd noticed everything. I stared right back at him, practically daring him to say something. He kept his mouth shut. But 2 days later, Ethan called me and suddenly had a whole lot more questions about Mason. What I didn't know at the time was that Ethan had asked Brandon to keep an eye on the house whenever he was in the neighborhood. Apparently, that first visit had confirmed some suspicions Ethan had already been trying to ignore. I completely lost it. I asked him whether Brandon was spying on me for him now. Nice, Ethan. Real nice. I told him it was wonderful to know just how much my own husband trusted me. Then I hung up while he was still talking. For the next 3 days, I ignored every call he made. And when I finally answered, I made Ethan apologize to me. Things finally crossed a line during the 6th month. Mason and I were having one of our usual evenings together, drinking wine and watching a movie, when a storm knocked out the power. We lit some candles, opened more wine, and ended up sitting on the floor talking and trading stories. Something about the candlelight changed the way Mason looked. It softened his features and, for a moment, he looked almost exactly like the boy I'd fallen for all those years earlier. When he reached over and gently brushed my hair away from my face, I let him. Then he leaned toward me. I didn't move away. When we kissed, it felt electric. It was like every part of me that had been asleep for months suddenly came alive again. I'd love to say that after that first kiss, reality hit me and I immediately pushed him away. I'd love to say I remembered my wedding vows and thought about my husband serving halfway across the world. But that's not what happened. Instead, Mason and I ended up making out on the couch like a couple of teenagers. And after spending so many months feeling lonely and forgotten, being wanted and touched again felt unbelievably good. We didn't go all the way. There was still one boundary I refused to cross. But even then, I knew what we'd already done was bad enough. The next morning, I woke up with 2 completely different feelings fighting inside me. Part of me was drowning in guilt, but another part felt strangely excited and alive. Mason acted like nothing unusual had happened. He went downstairs and made pancakes like it was just another normal morning. I couldn't bring myself to face Ethan after what I'd done, so I skipped our next video call completely. I texted him and claimed I'd gotten food poisoning. How was I supposed to look my husband in the eye after kissing another man? But here's the strange part. After a few days passed, that crushing guilt started wearing off. I began finding excuses that made what I'd done seem less terrible. I told myself Ethan was probably surrounded by female soldiers over there anyway. For all I knew, maybe he wasn't exactly behaving like a saint either. And besides, he had no idea what it was like to spend month after month alone. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. Eventually, I even started thinking that if Ethan truly loved me, maybe he wouldn't have chosen to leave me alone for an entire year in the first place. Mason and I never really sat down and talked about that kiss. Still, something between us had clearly changed. There was this new tension whenever we were together, like both of us knew there was now a possibility hanging in the air that hadn't existed before. We started sitting closer together when we watched TV. When one of us handed something to the other, our hands would sometimes brush, and neither of us seemed in much of a hurry to pull away. We never put a label on whatever was happening between us. Honestly, that made everything easier for me. If we never defined it, I could keep pretending nothing serious was actually happening. Eventually, I started dreading Ethan's video calls. Every time he told me he loved me or said how much he missed me, it somehow felt like an accusation, even though he had absolutely no idea what I'd been doing. Then he brought up Mason again. He wanted to know why a guy who was supposed to stay for a few weeks was somehow still living in our house 6 months later. Instead of answering the question, I turned the whole thing back on Ethan. I told him he should actually be grateful Mason was there keeping me company while he was gone. Then I asked whether he had any idea how lonely I'd been all those months. Ethan looked genuinely hurt. And I'm ashamed to admit that part of me liked seeing that. Let him hurt for a change, I thought. I'd been hurting for months. By then, the women around our military neighborhood definitely seemed to realize something wasn't right. Whenever Mason and I left the house together or came home carrying takeout, I'd notice people watching us. Then Heather, who lived 3 doors down, actually had the nerve to confront me at the grocery store. She asked whether Ethan knew how often I had company at the house. I gave her the sweetest smile I could manage and told her that Ethan trusted me completely. Some marriages actually have trust, I said. Meanwhile, inside my head, I was calling Heather every nasty name I could think of. Between you and me, I convinced myself those women were just jealous. They were sitting home alone, scrolling through pictures of their husbands' deployments, while at least I had someone around to keep me company at night. By that point, Mason wasn't really behaving like a temporary houseguest anymore. His mail was being delivered to our address. He knew the code to open the garage. At one point, he even rearranged the furniture in the living room without asking me first. And honestly, I didn't complain because the room actually looked better the way he'd arranged it. Sometimes Ethan would notice little changes in the background during our video calls and ask why the house looked different. I'd just shrug. I needed a change. He'd been gone forever. Things change. Life moves on. Around the same time, I started canceling plans with friends who knew Ethan. Avoiding them was easier than dealing with their suspicious looks and carefully worded questions. Instead, Mason and I started going to restaurants and bars in parts of town where nobody knew either of us. Out there, we could almost pretend we were a normal couple without constantly feeling the weight of my marriage hanging over us. Still, I kept telling myself this was temporary. I was just having some fun and keeping myself occupied until Ethan came home. It wasn't like I had some secret plan to divorce him and run away with Mason. As far as I was concerned, Mason was simply filling the empty space Ethan had left behind. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a completely ordinary Tuesday during the 8th month of Ethan's deployment. I was stretched out on the couch wearing one of Ethan's old t-shirts. If I'm being honest, I'd even started letting Mason wear some of Ethan's clothes occasionally. I was scrolling through my phone while Mason sat nearby playing video games when my phone suddenly buzzed. It was a text from Ethan. He said he'd gotten some unexpected news and told me to call him whenever I had a chance. Immediately, I felt this knot tighten in my stomach. Still, I tried convincing myself it couldn't be anything serious. Maybe his schedule had changed. Maybe they were moving him somewhere else. When I finally called, Ethan appeared on the screen wearing this enormous smile. The second I saw it, my stomach dropped. He told me he was coming home early. Apparently, he'd suffered a minor injury. Nothing major, just a sprained ankle, but the military was sending him and several other guys back home for specialized training. Then he said the words that made my mind completely freeze. He'd be home in 3 days. 3 days. For a few seconds, I could barely think. Somehow, though, I managed to put on the right expression and say everything a happy wife was supposed to say. I told him it was amazing news. I said I couldn't wait to see him. What an incredible surprise. Meanwhile, inside, I was completely panicking. The moment the call ended, I turned toward Mason. He'd heard the entire conversation. I told him he needed to move out immediately. Suddenly, after spending 8 months living comfortably in my house without paying rent, Mason acted offended. He wanted to know where he was supposed to go with only 3 days' notice. As far as I was concerned, that wasn't my problem. I reminded him that his arrangement had always been temporary. Mason actually laughed at me. Temporary? He pointed out that we'd basically been playing house together for months and told me not to pretend the arrangement hadn't benefited both of us. The next 2 days were absolute chaos. I cleaned the house like a woman possessed, desperately trying to erase every little sign of how deeply Mason had settled into my life. I gathered all his toiletries and dumped them into a box. I walked from room to room collecting clothes, shoes, chargers, and all the other random things he'd left scattered throughout the house. I even washed the sheets on every bed, despite the fact that we'd never crossed that final boundary. Mason made everything harder by dragging his feet. He barely packed and kept making little comments, clearly meant to make me feel guilty. So that was it, according to him. Ethan snapped his fingers, and suddenly Mason was supposed to disappear onto the street. Then he told me he'd thought whatever we had actually meant something. He accused me of running straight back to my perfect little military wife routine the second Ethan came home. I was trying to explain, again, that none of that mattered right now and that he absolutely needed to be gone before Ethan arrived. That's when headlights suddenly swept across the living room window. A second later, I heard a car door slam outside. My heart practically stopped. No, it couldn't be him. Ethan wasn't supposed to arrive until the following day. But when I looked outside, there he was. Ethan stood on our front porch with his duffel bag sitting beside his feet. He was leaning slightly on a crutch, and his face looked exhausted but happy. Then there was me. I stood frozen in the doorway with panic probably written all over my face. And behind me, Mason was stretched out comfortably on our couch with a beer in his hand, looking like he belonged there. I'll never forget the expression that came over Ethan's face when he saw the scene in front of him. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even shock. It was something worse. It was the look of a man seeing his worst suspicions confirmed right in front of him. Whatever Ethan had suspected before that moment, seeing Mason stretched out on our couch like he belonged there seemed to make it real in a way nothing else could. His eyes went to Mason. Then they moved to me. Then he noticed the half-packed boxes scattered around the room before finally looking back at me again. He quietly asked me what was going on. My first instinct was to act like everything was perfectly explainable. I pointed out that he'd come home early. Then I told him I was simply helping Mason pack because he was just about to leave. Even while I was saying it, I could hear how fake my own voice sounded. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He looked at me, then turned toward Mason, who hadn't even bothered getting off the couch. Finally, Ethan asked how long things between us had been crossing the line. Before I could come up with an answer, Mason opened his mouth. That snake told Ethan it had been going on for a couple of months. Then he actually apologized to him and said neither of us had planned for it to happen. The way he said it made us sound like we'd been carrying on some full-blown secret affair behind Ethan's back. Yes, we'd kissed several times. And sure, there had been moments when we'd gotten a little too close. But it still wasn't what Mason was making it sound like. Ethan didn't scream. He didn't punch a wall or start breaking things. Instead, he looked at me with those same eyes that used to be filled with so much love whenever he saw me. Then, in this incredibly calm voice, he told both of us to get out of his house that night. For a second, I genuinely couldn't believe what I'd heard. His house? I reminded him that it was our house. I was the one who'd actually been living there for the past 8 months. I'd been paying bills and keeping everything running while he'd been gone. Ethan calmly told me the house was legally in his name. He reminded me that his military housing allowance was paying the mortgage. Then he said something that completely blindsided me. Apparently, Brandon had been keeping an eye on the house for weeks and reporting back to Ethan. Ethan told me he'd known things between Mason and me weren't as innocent as I'd claimed. He just hadn't known how far it had really gone. That's when I started crying. Part of it was shock. But mostly, I was furious. The whole situation felt unbelievably unfair to me. Ethan had left me alone for months, and now he thought he had the right to throw me out because I'd found some comfort while he was gone? I turned toward Mason. I expected him to defend me. After everything we'd shared, I thought he'd stand beside me and help me face Ethan. Instead, Mason was already reaching for his jacket. Without even looking me in the eye, he mumbled something about crashing at Derek's place for the night. Then he told me to text him once I'd figured everything out. And just like that, he walked out. This was the same man who'd been telling me how much I meant to him. The guy who'd been beside me almost constantly for 8 months. He knew practically every detail of my life. And the second things became difficult, he disappeared. I just stood there stunned as the front door closed behind him. Ethan watched the entire thing happen with this almost unsettling calmness. Then he told me I had 1 hour to pack whatever I'd need for the night. I could return the following day to collect the rest of my belongings while he was at work. After that, Ethan limped past me and headed toward the bedroom. Our bedroom. He went inside and shut the door behind him. I stood there in complete disbelief. None of this felt real. This couldn't actually be happening to me. The second Ethan disappeared into the bedroom, I started calling Mason over and over again. He wouldn't answer. I tried everyone else after that, including the friends I'd basically ignored for the past several months. Some didn't pick up at all. Others answered, but suddenly had a dozen excuses for why I couldn't stay with them. Even my own sister told me she didn't want to get dragged into the mess I'd created. Between you and me, it felt like every single person in my life abandoned me at exactly the moment I needed someone the most. I had nowhere to go, and Ethan was literally keeping track of the time, so I started throwing whatever I could grab into suitcases. Clothes, toiletries, my laptop, some jewelry. Basically anything important enough to get me through the next few days. As I was finally walking toward the door, Ethan stopped me and handed me an envelope. Divorce papers. He said it so calmly that for a second, I didn't even understand what he'd just told me. Then he explained that he'd had them prepared the previous month after Brandon sent him pictures of Mason and me kissing in the driveway. Apparently, Ethan had already known. He told me he'd originally planned to sit down with me once he returned home. Maybe we'd talk everything through. Maybe there was even a chance we could somehow repair the marriage. But after coming home and seeing Mason practically living as the man of the house, Ethan said there was nothing left to save. My brain couldn't process any of it. I kept telling him he couldn't do this to me. Where was I supposed to go? What exactly was I supposed to do now? Ethan didn't answer. He simply opened the front door wider and motioned for me to leave. That first night, I checked into some cheap motel. Even then, I still believed Mason would eventually come through for me. Surely he'd let me stay with him while I figured out what to do next. After everything we'd shared over those 8 months, there had to be something real between us. Right? Wrong. I finally managed to reach him the following day. And Mason laughed. He actually laughed at me. Then he told me that we'd had fun together, but he wasn't interested in anything serious. According to him, I suddenly had too much baggage. And then, as if that wasn't insulting enough, he casually mentioned that he'd started talking to Lauren again. Lauren, his ex. The same woman he'd spent months telling me had broken his heart. That was when reality finally hit me. Hard. Within about a week, the joint accounts Ethan and I had shared were emptied out. His military pay had always been the main source of income in our marriage. My part-time office job barely gave me enough money for groceries, never mind rent in an area as expensive as ours. By then, Ethan had also told practically everyone in our social circle his version of what happened. People I'd once considered friends would literally cross the street rather than speak to me. And that military wives community I'd spent so much time mocking and avoiding? They closed ranks around Ethan immediately. For a while, I bounced from couch to couch. I'd stay with acquaintances until their sympathy started running out, then I'd pack my things and move on to the next person. Eventually, there wasn't another couch left. That's how I ended up where I am now, living out of my car. I shower at Planet Fitness and sometimes wash my hair there. I sit inside McDonald's using the free Wi-Fi to search for jobs and scroll through apartment listings I already know I can't afford. Eventually, I had to leave my office job after they cut my hours. Things became even worse after one of Ethan's friends, who happened to work in the same office park, started spreading rumors about me. But you want to know the real kicker? Through mutual connections on social media, I found out that Mason moved in with Lauren less than 2 weeks after Ethan threw me out. 2 weeks. Suddenly, all those stories about his terrible credit and how impossible it was for him to find somewhere to live didn't seem very believable. As far as I could tell, he'd been using me for free housing while he worked on getting back together with his ex. That's all I'd been to him. Convenient. About 3 months into living in my car, I saw Ethan again. I was parked near what used to be our favorite restaurant when I spotted him walking outside with another woman. She was pretty in that effortless, natural, girl-next-door way I'd never been able to pull off. And Ethan was smiling. Not some polite little smile. He was really smiling. The same way he used to look when he was happy with me. His ankles seemed completely healed by then. I watched them walk toward his car with his arm wrapped around her waist. I immediately sank lower in my seat. The last thing I wanted was for either of them to notice the dirty Honda sitting in the corner of the parking lot with fogged-up windows. So that's where my life ended up. I'm sleeping in a car while Ethan happily moves on with someone new, and Mason gets to play happy family with his ex. And somehow, everyone has decided I'm the villain of this entire story. But what about Ethan leaving me alone for months? What about Mason using me and tossing me aside the second I became inconvenient? What about all those so-called friends who disappeared when I needed help? Nobody seems interested in that part. Nobody wants to consider that maybe I was desperately trying not to feel lonely anymore. Maybe I just wanted to feel something besides abandoned. Then yesterday, I saw another update online. Ethan sold the house. Our house. Apparently, he's moving to Houston with his new girlfriend. She's military too. Some officer he met while he was doing physical therapy. And judging by their pictures, they're disgustingly happy together. Meanwhile, I'm desperately trying to save enough money to rent some apartment in the worst neighborhood I can find because nobody wants to approve me with my credit score. My credit completely tanked after months of falling behind on bills and relying on credit cards just to survive. And Mason? He's engaged to Lauren now. They're also having a baby. A baby. Seriously. A baby? This is the same man who spent 3 years telling me he wasn't ready for marriage or children. I guess what he really meant was that he wasn't ready for marriage or children with me. Between us, I hope Lauren figures out what kind of user he really is before it's too late. But knowing her, she probably won't. She always seemed a little desperate anyway. The military wives around town still glare at me whenever our paths cross. They act like every single one of them has some flawless marriage and perfect life. Please. I know for a fact that Heather's husband cheated during his first deployment. And Nicole's husband came home from his deployment with a serious drinking problem. But sure, I'm apparently the monster because I let an ex stay with me when I felt abandoned and alone. Some days, I seriously consider leaving town. Just getting in my car, driving somewhere completely different, and starting my life over where nobody knows my name or what happened. There's just one problem. I don't have the money. I don't have good references for jobs or apartments. And apparently, I don't have many marketable skills either. Sometimes it feels like the only thing I've ever been good at is making a man believe I'm worth coming home to, only for him to throw me away the moment it's convenient. I've applied for jobs in Dallas, Phoenix, even Chicago. But I barely hear back, and when I do, the offers aren't any better than what I can find here. Everyone tells me the same thing. I should have known this would happen. I made my choices, and now I have to deal with the consequences. But here's what nobody seems to understand. I didn't choose for Ethan to leave me alone for an entire year. I didn't choose for Mason to lie to me and use me. And I certainly didn't choose for practically everyone I knew to assume the worst about me without even bothering to listen to my side. That's the real problem with being a military wife. Everyone expects you to become this endlessly patient, perfectly loyal saint who smiles while her husband disappears for months at a time. You're supposed to sit quietly at home waiting for your hero to return. You're supposed to suffer without complaining and somehow feel grateful for the privilege of making that sacrifice. Well, I was suffering. I was lonely. I was miserable. And I was exhausted from constantly being the person left behind. But nobody wants to hear that part. So yes, letting Mason move into the house was a mistake. And yes, kissing him was another mistake. I'm not pretending those things didn't happen. But did those mistakes mean I deserved to lose absolutely everything? Did I deserve to become homeless? Did I deserve to have everyone treat me like I was worthless? No. I deserved better than what Ethan gave me. I deserved better than what Mason gave me. And I deserved better than what my life turned into. Someday, I'm going to get back on my feet. And when I do, every one of them will finally see what they threw away. Maybe Ethan will eventually discover that his perfect new girlfriend isn't nearly as perfect as she seems. Maybe Mason will get tired of pretending to be a devoted family man with Lauren, just like he eventually got tired of me. And maybe all those people who turned their backs on me will finally regret disappearing when I needed them most. Until that day comes, though, this is my reality. I'll keep washing my hair in a gym sink. I'll keep sleeping in the back of my Honda. And every night, I'll keep wondering how my entire life managed to fall apart when, from the beginning, all I ever wanted was to stop feeling so completely alone.